could just hang on to some brightness as we go into the afternoon. So if we do see that, highs here reaching around 21, 22 degrees, but elsewhere, more typical for the time of year, between around 16 to 19 degrees. Into the evening, very little change, still the risk of some further heavy rain across parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland. England and Wales, the rain a little bit more patchy, but for most of us, it'll be a fairly cloudy picture, and with winds generally coming in from the southwest. Actually, it'll be a warmer night than the night just gone. Maybe a little bit uncomfortable for some of us, especially in the south, with temperatures not much lower than around 16 or 17 degrees. But that humidity will quickly be replaced by some fresher air as we go into Saturday. The overnight rain moving away from the east as we approach midday. And for most of us in the afternoon, plenty of sunshine. Still some showers across the north, and these will be quite frequent and being blown in on a fairly strong wind. Could see some coastal gales for Scotland, and that will make it feel fairly fresh here. Temperatures not much higher than around 14 or 15 degrees. In the south, around typical for the time of year, so around 22, 23 for London, for example. And very little changes as we go into Sunday and Monday. A north-south split, quite wet and windy at times across the far north of Scotland. Elsewhere, sunny spells and a few showers, and temperatures on the whole around average.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think. Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
A very good morning to you. It's Friday the 30th of June and this is a brand new Friday edition of Britain's Newsroom here on GB News with me, Tom Harwood, and Ellie Costello.
Lots coming up for you on the programme today, including the government has unveiled its long-awaited NHS workforce plan today, with measures like shorter medical degrees in a bid to plug staffing black holes.
And Number 10 will continue its battle over these Rwanda deportations with a plan to appeal yesterday's ruling by the courts that these things are unlawful.
More Tory turmoil as Zac Goldsmith quits the government, saying the Prime Minister isn't interested in the environment.
And a swan stopped the £15 billion Elizabeth line in its tracks yesterday. Does this once again show just how broken Britain is?
And I do think we have to be careful with the swans because they are such beautiful creatures.
I would have just run it over.
We have very differing opinions on this and we want to hear your opinion at home, so do get in touch with us today, gbviews@gbnews.com. And also just to say that Esther and Phil are going to be back at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with a new edition of Saturday Morning Live. So we're very much looking forward to that. But first, let's get your news bulletin with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Ellie. Good morning. It is 9:31, your top stories from the GB Newsroom. And we start with some breaking news. Lord Goldsmith has resigned as a minister. Zac Goldsmith said the government's apathy on climate change made it untenable for him to remain Minister for the International Environment. He also claims Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is uninterested in the environment. The government's launching what's being described as the most radical modernisation and reform of the NHS in its history. Ahead of the 75th anniversary of the Health Service, the 15-year plan will aim to plug shortages of over 300,000 staff in England. With £2.4 billion worth of funding over 5 years, the plan focuses on retaining and training staff as well as adopting advanced technologies like AI. The High Court will hear the government's legal challenge against the COVID inquiry's demand for Boris Johnson's unredacted WhatsApp messages, diaries and personal notebooks. The Cabinet Office argues the inquiry lacks the authority to compel the release of unambiguously irrelevant material. The hearing begins today and concludes on Monday. And the Duke of Sussex's lawsuit against Mirror Group newspapers over allegations of phone hacking is due to conclude today. The trial's over alleged unlawful information gathering between 1996 and 2011. The Mirror Group denies any wrongdoing. And you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com. Now, it's back to Tom and Ellie.
Well, the Prime Minister is launching what is being described as the most radical reform of the NHS in its history later today.
Yes, the 15-year plan will aim to plug shortages of up to 360,000 staff and save taxpayers £10 billion.
The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, says that the NHS has been calling for a long-term plan like the government is unveiling, one exactly like that today.
It's so we can get those waiting lists down, so we can ensure that we get the treatment, the extra capacity into the system. But what today is also about is responding to something the NHS has asked for many years, which is to have a long-term plan. It will be iterative, it's not a one-off. We'll keep coming back to it and working on it in terms of as the modelling evolves.
But Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting said the government should have taken action long ago.
Why do we need the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history? Why do we have such an understaffed NHS? It's because over the last 13 years we've not had a workforce plan. It is the biggest expansion since the last Labour government, which delivered 75,000 more nurses and 44,000 more doctors.
Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting there. Now, we're kicking off this brand new show here, this Friday edition of Britain's Newsroom, with this issue, because it's something that so many people across the country feel every day. The NHS is so close to all of our hearts.
Right. Well, it must be one of the biggest polling issues, mustn't it? I mean, if you're looking at what matters to voters across the board, is the NHS. And I think something that people can always agree on, whatever party you vote for, is that the NHS needs reform. So I do think this is going to be welcome.
Absolutely. And of course, Rishi Sunak said it was his number 3 pledge, if we will remember, cut those waiting lists. But let's get some more on this story, and indeed some others. We're joined now by the political commentator John Oxley. And John, I suppose the Labour Party has come up with a fairly clever line here, saying, well, if you say this is so needed, so necessary, why didn't you do it all those years ago?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the sort of thing you say when you've been in opposition for 13 years and the other side have been in government. But I think what this interestingly shows is they're not actually attacking the details of the plan, which is good for Rishi Sunak politically, but also shows this is probably going to be something that the Labour government are going to continue when they're in office. You know, and potentially, if they win the next general election in 5 or 10 years' time when we come round again, the Conservatives are going to be in a good position of saying, well, of course the NHS has improved, but it's because we kicked this off in 2023 and they've just taken the credit.
What's your reaction to these plans, John? Because, as you say, it does seem to be going down well. It's been received well across the board.
Yes, it seems like a very sensible plan, because what they're doing is, rather than taking on the big scary issues of how do we fund the NHS, they're looking at how do we get more doctors and nurses? How do we solve this retention and recruitment issue? And really looking at one of the big problems that for many years we've not hired enough people, and particularly around training for doctors. We've turned away hundreds, thousands of people who want to train as doctors who are applying for university. We've had a very strict cap, and instead ended up recruiting doctors from abroad. And so we're looking at that and fixing that, and also similarly on nurses, looking at different ways to qualify nurses, getting away from the degree model to more apprenticeships and more routes into the profession. So it seems like something that is going to really tackle that big problem of, do we have enough people working in the NHS?
The branding around this is really interesting, because the government is not saying, this is Rishi Sunak's plan. The government is not saying, this is the Conservatives' plan. They're saying, this is the NHS's plan, supported by the government. We're going to be hearing a lot from figures within the NHS today, and the government saying, we're doing what the NHS wants us to. I suppose that's clever political messaging.
Absolutely. I think the Conservatives always have a problem around the NHS, that when they come up with a plan, particularly you look at the Andrew Lansley plan, sort of 10 years ago, that everyone gets a bit suspicious, that do we really trust the Conservatives with the NHS? Is this a way to cut costs rather than deliver better service? But by saying this is what health officials, this is what doctors want, then yes, it's got a huge political advantage, and allows them to really own the plan and really puts the Labour Party, as we've seen already with Wes Streeting, he's saying, well, this is great, but you could have done this earlier, which is not the same attack as saying, no, this is a bad plan, Labour's plan for the NHS is much better. It makes it very hard to criticise a plan that's come largely from within the organisation.
I mean, John, as you say, retention and recruitment issues have plagued the NHS for a very, very long time now. What is so interesting looking at this plan is pay is not mentioned. I mean, is that part of that clever branding, you think, of avoiding those big issues such as funding? Perhaps that's why they haven't mentioned pay. Instead, they're focused on recruitment. But does that then go far enough for existing staff who actually just aren't happy with their pay at the moment, as we've seen through strike action?
I think, that's absolutely one of the problems, and you've seen this week there's been further strikes announced. There's a big risk of doctors moving abroad. You see on the picket lines, the Australian health services are turning up and basically offering people jobs on the picket lines. But what this starts to do is it starts to reduce the workload around the NHS. Part of the problem for doctors and nurses is we are about 100,000 staff short of where we need to be. And ultimately, a lot of them have to pick up the slack. So it's not just about pay, it's about working conditions, and those two go together. But I think you're absolutely right. This is a way of talking about the things that are a bit easier than getting into how much are we going to pay doctors and nurses this year and next year when there's already a big strain on public finances.
Now, talking about easy things and talking about hard things, perhaps the government would want everyone to be talking about how good their NHS recruitment plan is today. What they might not want to be talking about is the debacle of yesterday, the Court of Appeal judgment that said that the government's signature Rwanda plan is unlawful. We've now learned that the government wants to appeal this ruling, which perhaps is no surprise. But is this a political win or a setback for the government?
I think it depends how the future plays out. There's sort of two routes for the Conservatives. One is, this Rwanda plan gets stopped, and then we go into the sort of debate some people in the Conservative Party want to have about repealing the Human Rights Act, about withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights. But potentially, the bigger problem for the Tories is this plan they've talked a lot about. It was, again, one of Rishi Sunak's key pledges was stopping the boats. Isn't going to happen in the short term. There isn't a lot of time to do things like repealing the Human Rights Act or pulling out the ECHR. So probably you're going to get to the next polling day and you're going to be saying, well, your plan to send these people to Rwanda hasn't happened. Not a single flight has taken off.
But looking at that, could the government not say, if we get up to that polling day and they say, look, we've been trying to send these planes to Rwanda, we've got all these plans in place, but for want of a better term, the blob, activist lawyers, even the UNHCR, lots of different individuals, groups, conspired to sort of stop this in its tracks in the courts. Is that an argument that might well carry favour with voters, or are we now far too through this process?
I think it's very difficult to ask for another 5 years in power saying, look at all the things we wanted to get done that we still haven't got done. And I think that's absolutely the line the Conservatives are probably going to have to take. But how much it gels with voters is a different matter, particularly when, potentially we're seeing all of those plans unravel. Inflation is still remaining quite high. The economy is struggling. Are voters going to indulge the Conservative Party when they're saying, look, we'd really like to do these things, but we can't do it, but vote for us this time. We'll do it next time, we promise.
Well, the government says it's still committed to the Rwanda plan. Do you think that's the right thing? Are they right to press ahead with this, or should they be coming up with a plan B? As you say, election day is looming. They haven't got long to make a move on this.
I think the Rwanda plan, if anything, should only be forming one strand of what they're trying to do with regard to this boat problem, that it's going to take a long time, it's going to be subject to all these queries, and it's going to be hugely expensive. And there's a broader problem about, for example, the lack of safe and legal routes, which exacerbates this problem. Rishi Sunak said yesterday, we want the government to decide who gets to come here, not criminal gangs. Well, the reality is, under the current system, the only way to come here, no matter how valid or invalid your asylum claim is to pay one of these criminal gangs and get brought here and see what happens when you put your application in. So I think there should be a broader focus on the bigger aspects of these problems around small boats, and it should be one plank. What the government are doing at the moment is they're really committing all their eggs into this one basket, and it looks like it's not going to succeed in the short term.
No, it's a really, really interesting issue because you mentioned the 5 pledges of Rishi Sunak that he made at the start of the year. At the start of the year, all of the commentary was, oh, he's set such a low bar for himself. All of these are eminently achievable. There aren't really sort of strong metrics by which you can judge this, and by the way, inflation's going to tumble anyway. It's not looking quite so easy now. Has he made a mistake here?
Well, I think you always have to set out what you're trying to do, and you have to be honest with the public about the challenges that go ahead. But I think, whenever you pin yourself to 5 identifiable things, even if the numbers around them are a bit fuzzy, people are going to look at those and think, have you delivered? And increasingly, you go down that list, and 6 months on, it's not looking like that. And there's a year, 18 months towards the election, but that's not a lot of time to really get onto those things, and particularly around inflation. The danger now is the way to crank down on inflation is generally ramping up interest rates, which, OK, that gets inflation down, but if someone's mortgage has gone up massively, they're not really feeling the benefit.
The old phrase, if it's not hurting, it's not working.
Exactly.
I've got to ask you about Lord Goldsmith, who's just resigned before we came on to the programme. What's your reaction to that?
I think it's an interesting move, particularly at this time. He was criticised by the Privilege Committee the other day, but also, he is someone who's a very close political ally of Boris Johnson, Carrie Johnson, Boris's wife, worked for him for quite a long period of time. They are very close. I think it's a very interesting move to be leaving the government at this time, and feels like one of those things that is designed to sort of upset Rishi a little bit.
And you don't think then this is about the environment?
I think that's a handy excuse when you look at the timing, and it's interesting that sort of Rishi yesterday very strongly backed Lord Goldsmith following the Privilege Committee report, but now he's gone. So I think maybe he's just tired of being around in government, but it feels like if he was really committed to the environment, he'd stay around and fight his cause a bit more.
It's interesting because this is the big day that the government tried to wrestle control of the news agenda for once, having everyone talking about what they wanted to talk about, this new plan, all the NHS heads saying, isn't this wonderful, the recruitment, and yet Lord Goldsmith inserting him into this conversation, particularly on a Friday when Sunday morning papers will no doubt carry a lot of this internal psychodrama.
That's a big problem the Conservatives are facing at the moment, and will really be facing going up to the next election, that the party is divided into these factions. They all kind of know a defeat is coming, so there's not much incentive to pull together. But that just makes everything harder for Rishi Sunak and the party as a whole, because whenever you're doing one of these announcements, there's always someone or something that can come out and you lose the news day. And rather than talking about what the Conservatives are trying to achieve and indeed are achieving, you get back into Westminster gossip, and that's a real problem if you're trying to build an election campaign.
And how do you think he feels about being named in that supplementary report from the Privileges Committee yesterday?
I like to think he finds it a bit embarrassing, but I think, like all of these people who are very close to Boris Johnson and attack the report, they were quite bullish about it. I don't know how much they care, how much they see it as sort of badge of honour that they went into bat for their friend. So hard to know how much that affected him.
Well, John Oxley, thank you so much for talking us through those big political stories kicking off the day and indeed kicking off the news here on Britain's Newsroom.
Yes, two really big stories. I just want to bring you a little bit of that statement because it is really interesting, isn't it, Tom? We were looking at that in the newsroom just before we came on to air. So this is a letter that Zach Goldsmith has sent to Rishi Sunak, and it's the wording of this which is very interesting. Prime Minister, having been able to get so much done previously, I have struggled even to hold the line in recent months. The problem is not that the government is hostile to the environment, it is that you, our Prime Minister, are simply uninterested. And that has trickled down through Whitehall. So it does seem very personal, doesn't it?
It is personal. You, Prime Minister, but also it's talking, again, focusing on the environment. Perhaps there was some more to this, and perhaps we'll be.
You changed
well, I don't know. I've been listening to what John Oxley's been saying. I've been thinking about that Privileges report. What is Boris Johnson thinking about this? What might Boris Johnson's Daily Mail column this afternoon, when it's published, indeed for tomorrow's paper, what might that be saying too?
Very interesting. I'm looking forward to reading that. But do let us know what you think at home. What do you make of Zach Goldsmith's resignation? Do you think it was about the environment, or do you think there's a little more going on here? And of course, we're talking about NHS reform. Is it enough? Should it have happened a long time ago? Let us know what you think.
But of course, the phone hacking trial brought about by Prince Harry and other celebrities against the Mirror Group newspapers will be reaching its final conclusions today.
The lawsuit alleges unlawful information gathering between 1996 and 2011, claiming Mirror Group journalists used methods like phone hacking and employing private investigators for unlawful activities.
But what does this all mean? What are we actually going to hear today? Let's speak to Cameron Walker, GB News royal correspondent, for the very latest. So, Cameron, of course, that testimony from Prince Harry, it feels like quite a long time ago now. That's all been leading up to this moment. What are we going to hear?
Yeah, it certainly was, Tom, and it was a pretty dramatic testimony, and Prince Harry became the first senior member of the royal family since the 19th century to physically appear in court as a witness, and he spent 2 days here at the beginning of the month in front of the world's media being forensically examined by a KC barrister who questioned every detail of his allegations against Mirror Group newspapers, who he accuses of unlawful information gathering, so phone hacking, so-called blagging, the use use of deception to gain private information, and the use, as you said, Tom, of private investigators to obtain unlawful information unlawfully. Now, in Prince Harry's witness statement, he said that some journalists had blood on their typing fingers. The Duke seems convinced in his testimony that the information obtained in order to write unfavourable articles about him was obtained unlawfully. But under cross-examination by Mr. Andrew Green KC, who represents Mirror Group newspapers, he put it to Prince Harry that actually a lot of the information he's alleging was obtained unlawfully was already in the public domain, either through other publications publishing the information first, or in some cases, even palace press officers or Buckingham Palace spokespeople putting the information out there in the public domain. He also pointed out to what Mr. Andrew Green KC described as lack of direct evidence. But Prince Harry, in response to that, says that a lot of that direct evidence had been destroyed, in his view, due to the use of alleged burner phones. But this week is all about the closing arguments. And Mirror Group newspapers has already paid, this is what Mr. Andrew Green KC said in his closing arguments yesterday. They've already paid more than £100 million in compensation to what he described as genuine victims of unlawful information gathering who had direct evidence. Now, Mirror Group newspapers have said that Prince Harry is entitled to £500 of compensation. That's due to one article written with unlawful information back in 2004. And he said the latest wave of litigation from Prince Harry and the other well-known figures who are suing Mirror Group newspapers in this case was done because they are being told by their associates that they may have a claim, and that when they contacted solicitors, the solicitors and lawyers actively encouraged them to pursue Mirror Group newspapers. Well, David Sherborne KC, who's representing Prince Harry, he said that Harry is a prime target for tabloid journalism, tabloid journalists even, and he said that the findings made by previous litigation against Mirror Group newspapers back in 2015, which included a former Mirror Group newspaper editor having Prince Harry's phone number, but also being one of the 5 most prolific users even of phone hacking methods, means that in this case it's implausible, according to David Sherborne, that Prince Harry was not a victim of unlawful information gathering. So clearly 2 sides to this, and the case is due to wrap up today here at the High Court in central London. Mr. Justice Fancourt, who is the judge in this case, is due to make a ruling at a later date.
Cameron Walker, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there. Thank you.
Well, let's talk some more about some of these emails that have been rushing in, because there is a bit of a royal angle to this too. Ernie wrote in to me. If you might remember at the top of the show, we spoke a bit about how the Elizabeth line was blocked yesterday, was stopped for a very long time.
Hour, yeah.
Because one swan happened to be on the tracks. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a good reason to stop a £15 billion railway. Lots of people disagree with me. Please do get in touch, gbviews@gbnews.com. But Ernie has written in to say, Tom, swans are protected and belong to the king.
Wow.
Well, what a royal segue.
Well, Ernie, let me tell you something, because I was Googling this morning. It's only wild swans that belong to the king, so we're not actually sure if this one was a wild one or not. But it certainly made its way onto the Elizabeth line track, and they are protected by the king, so you can face an unlimited fine and even time in prison if you hurt a swan. So I can see actually why the Elizabeth line didn't do anything.
I think the king would want the railway that was dedicated to his mother to continue to run.
Well, I think we are a nation of animal lovers, and they are beautiful creatures. I can understand why you had to leave it best alone. Although I would say you need to be very good at shoeing with swans.
Perhaps we found a middle ground here.
Yeah.
I have a feeling, looking at all of these emails, I have a feeling the inbox is more on your side than mine.
Oh, no.
I think we are perhaps a nation.
What are your thoughts? They should have run it over.
I just think that, I mean, ideally shoeing it. Ideally, you don't want a clean up job, right? No, I mean, I just think it's ridiculous. There surely would be a way to get these trains running. To not suspend, it's supposed to be a regular service, and to have it suspended for an hour in the biggest city in this part of the world. I mean, I despair.
I mean, the Elizabeth line has been plagued with issues, hasn't it? So this is just the latest in a long line. But anyway, let us know what you make, and do stay with us. Lots more to come, including the most radical reform in NHS history. That's after this.
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Pretty drab out there this Friday, lots of cloud around. Most places fairly damp as well, and it's a bit cooler than it has been, certainly compared to the rest of the month. This set of weather fronts have been steadily moving in through the night, and they're bringing the cloud and the outbreaks of rain. Quite mild air tucked in here, so quite a humid feel, but with the rain and drizzle, temperatures suppressed down below average and certainly lower than they have been for much of June. Parts of East Anglia still reasonably bright, but even here it will cloud over. Probably not seeing too much rain here until later on. Elsewhere, rain and drizzle will just tend to come and go through the day, keeping those temperatures in the high teens. But as I said, still quite a humid feel in parts of the west in particular. As we go into the weekend, well, that cloud and rain will continue to drift across most areas through this evening and start to pull away as we go through the early hours. Generally, though, it's going to be an overcast night, rain and drizzle on and off, and turning quite breezy around the west. A pretty warm night as well, particularly so in the east. Temperatures further west starting to dip away a little towards dawn, and that's a sign of a bit of a change as we head into the weekend. Should be a much brighter day tomorrow. Yes, it'll start pretty cloudy with further rain and drizzle. There will be more showers to come, chiefly over Scotland, some for northern England, the odd one for Northern Ireland. Much of the south of the country, though, dry, brightening up with sunny spells. Going to get pretty blustery, though. Gusty winds likely across northern Scotland. It could be a very wet day in Shetland. Temperatures a bit higher, particularly with some sunny spells over eastern parts of England, getting back into the low 20s. Through Saturday evening, it stays very blustery over much of Scotland. Very gusty winds in the far north. Further heavy showers coming in here as well. Elsewhere, again, mostly dry and a fresher night to come. A fresh feel, bright and breezy day for Sunday with some showers across the north and again, very windy across Scotland. Goodbye.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6 is Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com? You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good morning, it's 10 o'clock on Friday, the 30th of June. This is Britain's Newsroom with Tom Harwood and me, Ellie Costello.
And here's what's coming up on the show. Happening today, the government unveils its long-awaited NHS work for plans. But what are in these plans, and will they work?
We'll have the latest as Number 10 is set to appeal and continue its battle over the Rwanda deportations, following yesterday's ruling by the courts that they are unlawful.
And more Tory turmoil as Zac Goldsmith sensationally quits the government, saying the Prime Minister isn't interested in the environment.
Rioting and looting continued across France last night following the killing of a teenager in Paris earlier this week. We'll go live to the French capital.
Yeah, lots going on in Paris, especially as Macron's been missing in action as he attended an Elton John concert. Get in touch with your views on that, gbviews@gbnews.com. And remember, this is the first Friday edition of Britain's Newsroom. Esther and Phil will be back with you at 10 a.m. tomorrow for a new show as well. So all happening here on GB News, but we'll get right with the action after the headlines with Rhiannon.
Good morning. It's 1 minute past 10. Your top stories from the GB Newsroom. The government's launching what's being described as the most radical modernisation and reform of the NHS in its history. Ahead of the 75th anniversary of the Health Service, the 15-year plan will aim to plug shortages of over 300,000 staff in England. With £2.4 billion worth of funding over 5 years, it focuses on retaining and training staff, as well as adopting advanced technologies like AI. Steve Barclay told us reform like this has been a long time coming.
It's so we can get those waiting lists down, so we can ensure that we get the treatment, the extra capacity into the system. But what today is also about is responding to something the NHS has asked for many years, which is to have a long-term plan. It will be iterative, it's not a one-off. We'll keep coming back to it and working on it in terms of as the modelling evolves.
The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, speaking there. Well, meanwhile, Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting says it's taken too long to implement the measures.
Why do we need the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history? Why do we have such an understaffed NHS? It's because over the last 13 years, we've not had a workforce plan. It is the biggest expansion since the last Labour government, which delivered 75,000 more nurses and 44,000 more doctors.
Lord Zac Goldsmith has resigned from government a day after the Tory minister was named in a Privileges Committee report for interfering in Boris Johnson's Partygate probe. In his resignation letter, Lord Goldsmith accused the government of apathy on climate change, saying it made his role as Minister for International Environment untenable. He also claims Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is uninterested in the environment. Households in the UK will pay less for their gas and electricity from tomorrow, but bills will remain higher than they were before the energy crisis. A new price cap set by the regulator Ofgem comes into effect this weekend. It'll see households with typical energy usage pay £2,074. That's a fall of £426 a year. However, bills will remain a lot higher than they were 2 years ago, £800 more expensive. That's almost double.
The Duke of Sussex's lawsuit against Mirror Group newspapers over allegations of phone hacking is due to conclude today. The trial is over alleged unlawful information gathering between 1996 and 2011. The Mirror Group denies any wrongdoing. And Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey faces 12 charges of sex offences against 4 men. The 63-year-old arrived at Southwark Crown Court this morning for a 4-week trial. The alleged offences took place between 2001 and 2013. Mr Spacey denies all of the charges against him. In France, President Emmanuel Macron is holding a second crisis meeting following the worst night of rioting yet, following the police shooting of a teenager. More than 650 people were arrested and 40,000 officers deployed as clashes continued for a third night, with the violence spreading to other cities as well as Paris across the country. Hundreds of police were injured by protesters. And 16 million Brits will be able to live and work in Australia as the age for working holiday visas is raised tomorrow. The limit will increase from 30 to 35. The visa duration will also be extended from 2 to 3 years without the need for consecutive stays or farm work. The free trade agreement between the two countries enables similar arrangements for Australians to work and travel here in the UK. And the King will receive a special sword named the Elizabeth when he visits Edinburgh next week. King Charles will be presented with the sword before the national service of Thanksgiving at St Giles's Cathedral on the 5th of July. The Elizabeth, inspired by thistles and Scotland's landscape, replaces the deteriorating sword of state. This is GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back over to Tom and Ellie.
Thanks, Rhiannon, and good morning to everyone watching and listening. This is a new Britain's Newsroom on a Friday with me and Tom.
It's so nice to be with you, Ellie.
I know, it's so good to be with you as
well.
well.
Also, it's such a big news day to be kicking off this show on. We've got so much to talk about throughout the next hour. We'll be kicking off with a bit of Rwanda, of course. The fallout from yesterday's bombshell court decision and where this goes on next.
Yeah, it's quite embarrassing for the government, really, isn't it? Of course, we're going to be talking about Lord Goldsmith as well. He resigned just before we came on air, which is a lovely start to our first show together, wasn't it, Tom?
So nice of him to have timed his... perhaps some might form it as an attack on government, just to kick off with this programme. Of course, he's a loyal viewer and listener, no doubt. But also the NHS reforms. That's the government's big policy announcement today. Can we plug this 100,000 worker gap in the NHS, expected to explode to a 300,000 worker gap in the NHS? Could this be the plan to solve that problem?
Yep, it needs to be fixed. Is this the way to fix it? Let us know. Just share a few of your views. Linda from Crawford is talking about Zach Goldsmith this morning, saying, great he resigned. We, the British public, don't want to be #1 in net zero in the world.
And Maria has written in to say, is it just me or has anyone else picked up similar parallels between what's happening with Donald Trump in the USA and Nigel Farage in the UK politically? This is, of course, referring to the huge news yesterday that Nigel Farage has been banned from having a bank account in his country, seemingly. Maria is not happy about that and is asking, are the left trying to create scenarios where neither of them will be able to stand politically? Perhaps we'll be talking a little bit about that later on. But let's get to this enormous story now, this ongoing legal battle over the government's flagship immigration policy.
Yeah, it's set to reach new heights, isn't it? Yeah. Well, it comes after Downing Street insisted it would fight to overturn a ruling that is sending refugees to Rwanda was unlawful.
Well, Conservative MPs have called for a plan B to tackle this small boats crisis. That's as the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, told MPs that the appeal court ruling is disappointing for the majority of the British people.
Well, we're joined now by barrister Chris Daw KC. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really good to have you with us. First of all, I just wanted to get your reaction to the Home Secretary's comments yesterday. Speaking to MPs, she said that the ruling was disappointing for the majority of British people. Is that what you think?
I I doubt it very much if the majority of the British people were aware of the detail of the ruling, because what the judges pointed out was that every single person who's sent to Rwanda is going to cost the taxpayer £170,000, of which £105,000 will be paid to the Rwandan government. Now, I wonder if your viewers might want to reflect on what we could do with £170,000 rather than giving it to Rwanda, a country which is renowned for historical human rights abuses, including the arrest and imprisonment of journalists like yourselves.
I suppose the government might say that we spend £6 million a day on migrant hotels in this country. And so, in comparison, if this has a deterrent effect, even sending a few people to Rwanda and stop that sort of hotel farce in this country, it could save money in the long run.
Well, it can't. It's nonsense. And I'll tell you what needs to happen. It's very straightforward. We just need to spend a lot less than that per person to process people through the asylum claim system as quickly as possible. And in my view, if we had adequate resource in our asylum system, we could have all of these cases dealt with within 28 days, including time for an appeal. And if anyone was found not to be entering the country as a refugee, they would be sent back where they came from. I think that's what people expect. What they don't want is a ridiculous policy of sending people to a country, as I say, which has been littered with human rights abuses, which inevitably, and as the Court of Appeal found yesterday, will involve successful challenges, because we live in a country which is historically been one of the forefront or the foremost countries in support of basic human rights. We drafted the European Convention on Human Rights as a country. We've been involved in the United Nations Charter. Britain is the great bastion of human rights. And if we decide to send people from this country to a country that is the exact opposite in human rights terms, lo and behold, there's going to be huge costs, there's going to be massive litigation.
Chris, hang on. Do you not think that's a little bit unfair about Rwanda? Because that's not what the judgment yesterday said. The judgment yesterday didn't say that Rwanda itself was an unsafe country. In fact, in many ways, it was quite glowing about the improvements that have taken place in Rwanda. The specific point of detail that 2 out of the 3 judges, of course, it was a split decision, the specific detail was not the risk in Rwanda, it was the risk that people might go off from Rwanda to other countries that are deemed unsafe. Rwanda wasn't deemed unsafe.
Yeah, Rwanda is unsafe, though. It's unsafe for anyone who wants to express their opinion, who wants to, for example, women who want to become involved in politics. It's a country which has massive historical repression of human rights. But you're absolutely right that the fine detail of the judgment in this case was that the Rwandans couldn't be trusted not to send people back to be tortured in their home countries. And if they can't be trusted to do that, they can't be trusted with asylum seekers. It's pretty obvious, I would have thought.
And Chris, very briefly, what happens next? Is this going to go to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, it's definitely going to go to the Supreme Court. I mean, the government may or may not win in the Supreme Court. Nobody knows. That's the nature of an appeal. But all I would say to your viewers is this, and to you is, why don't we just have a fleet of drones? We've spent hundreds of millions on the French government and subsidising the French government to stop people crossing the channel. Surely, if we invested in technology and the requisite security resources, we could just stop people getting here in the first place, rather than spending all this time, billions it will be, just to make a political statement that we're getting tough on the boat people. Because let's be fair, that's what this is really about.
Quite possibly. Chris Daw, really appreciate your time here on Britain's Newsroom. And, of course, we look ahead to that Supreme Court battle where, as you say, this is really still in the balance. This is not a done deal quite yet. Chris Daw, KC, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Well, joining us now to discuss this further is GB News Home Security Editor Mark White. And, Mark, this is one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, isn't it, to stop the boats. So this is rather embarrassing for the government, isn't it?
There's no doubt it is. It took the government completely by surprise. All the mood music we were getting was they were fairly confident that the appeal court judges would follow in the footsteps, really, and the decision that was handed down by the High Court in December of last year. So when that came through, they were left scrambling to come up with, in the end, what we saw was some fairly robust language in their determination to continue fighting this and taking it to the Supreme Court. And they will do that. It is an important part of the Stop the Boats campaign, whatever Chris might say there in his sort of objection to this particular policy. The government sees it as being vital in terms of acting as a deterrent for the criminal gangs coming across. And it's never been more urgent. We've got images we can show you for those watching on television. I'll explain to our radio listeners. It is images of the latest arrivals in Dover Harbour this morning. The small boats that are arrived, 2 so far, 111, our producer in Kent counted them coming off these Border Force catamarans in at Dover Harbour, another small boat en route. Now, this is happening while weather conditions in the Channel are less than ideal. And although Rishi Sunak just a few weeks ago came up and said that in a press conference, government policy was starting to take effect, that numbers were down by 20%, actually, in the weeks since then, there has been a bit of an improvement in the weather conditions and the numbers have rocketed again. We are rapidly approaching 12,000, which is still a bit down on where we were at this point last year, but we are heading towards the flat calm months where many people, potentially 1,000 a day or more in the very calm flat days will come across the Channel.
And yet now there's no chance, or very slim chance, of a single flight going to Rwanda this year. This won't be sorted in time for the election. The Prime Minister will fail in his key pledge to voters.
You know, I think even if the government had won in the Court of Appeal yesterday, we still wouldn't be getting any flights taken off, because the briefings we were getting was that Rishi Sunak wanted to see the whole of the legal process in this country exhausted. So going to the Supreme Court was the inevitable next step, because they knew, the government knew, that there would be an appeal if they won and the other parties lost. Yeah, and they would not seek to remove anybody until that final decision by the highest court in the land had been made. And that's not going to happen, as you say, Tom, until at least the end of the year, perhaps early next year, because I think it's October, November time we're talking about it being penciled in as an opportunity for the Supreme Court to deliberate on this matter. Then it'll be a reserve judgment, which usually is a month or two after they've sat considering the matter. So, yeah, it could be well into next year before actually any flights take off. Of course, that is on the proviso that it goes in the government's favour.
OK, Mark White, really good to see you this morning. Thank you so much for your analysis and those pictures as well from Dover this morning. Do let us know what you think at home. What do you make of that judgment in the Court of Appeal yesterday? It is now going to go to the Supreme Court. What do you make of it all? GBNews at gbnews.com.
But of course, that's not the only political story in town today. No, the Prime Minister is launching what's being described as the most radical reform of the NHS in its history.
Yes, the 15-year plan will aim to plug shortages of up to 360,000 staff and save taxpayers £10 billion.
Well, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, says that the NHS has been calling for a long-term plan like the government is unveiling today.
It's so we can get those waiting lists down, so we can ensure that we get the treatment, the extra capacity into the system. But what today is also about is responding to something the NHS has asked for many years, which is to have a long-term plan. It will be iterative. It's not a one-off. We'll keep coming back to it and working on it in terms of as the modelling evolves.
But Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting said the government should have taken action long ago.
Why do we need the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history? Why do we have such an understaffed NHS? It's because over the last 13 years, we've not had a workforce plan. It is the biggest expansion since the last Labour government, which delivered 75,000 more nurses and 44,000 more doctors.
Well, let's cross to Downing Street now, where joining us is GB News political reporter Catherine Foster, who's across this story. And Catherine, the government isn't seeing that much resistance to the actual ideas in this package.
No, this has gone down broadly very well with pretty much everybody. Labour included. Labour, of course, are saying basically, you've nicked our plan. This is what we've been suggesting, the doubling of medical school places, etc. But it's been broadly welcomed by health professionals too. And of course, we've had many plans for the NHS before, but this long-term workforce plan spanning 15 years really is quite a big deal. The government are putting £2.4 billion of new money into this over the next 5 years, and over the 15 years in total they should have over 300,000 new doctors, new nurses and other healthcare workers. They're looking at moving the time it takes to become a doctor down from 5 years to 4. They're looking at far more apprenticeships where people will be earning as they're learning, degree apprenticeships, meaning that people can be actually working in the NHS and training at the same time. They want to get far more homegrown talent into the NHS. Of course, it's Britain's largest employer, but we are very reliant on workers from overseas and also on agency staff who are vastly expensive. So the thinking is train people here and also retain them. So great going forward. Of course, many questions. First of all, is the government going to be in power long enough to implement much of this, bearing in fact the fact there's going to be a general election in a year to a year and a half? And also, of course, it may serve challenges going forward, but the NHS is under huge challenges right now. We have a 5-day doctors' strike looming in July. That is unprecedented, and Rishi Sunak, of course, has promised to get waiting lists down. Now, at the moment, they're really not budging. And of course, there's this ongoing dispute with the doctors. They want 36%. Of course, that's not likely to happen. But suggestions now that the recommendations from the pay review bodies that the government has previously clung to as saying, we will give whatever the pay review bodies recommend, suggestions now that the government may not honour that. So, OK, they may be recruiting lots of doctors, lots of nurses going forward, but they face very real challenges now in keeping the ones that they've got.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much for bringing us that very latest. No doubt some big challenges for the government there. Thanks for bringing us the latest there from Downing Street.
Do get in touch with your views on the NHS reform plans. As Tom says, they are being received quite well across the board. GBnews at gbnews.com. But still to come, the government is cutting off access to something it once described as life-saving. What is it? Well, we'll find out more after this.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys. On GB News, I'm GB News Radio.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Channel.
Good morning, the time is 10:25 and you're with Britain's Newsroom on GB News with Tom Howard and Ellie Costello. And we've got loads of you getting in touch with us this morning on this swan story we're talking about this morning. Essentially, Elizabeth Line in London, it was suspended yesterday for over an hour because a swan was on the track.
Just one swan, a £15 billion railway delivering hundreds of thousands of journeys, supposed to be frequent, supposed to be the shining example of modern Britain, and a swan stopped it in its tracks.
Yes, but a swan, and if it was a dog, you wouldn't let a train run over it. So that's how I feel.
Because a dog wouldn't be so silly to get on the track.
Well, it could do. You
No,
don't
I don't
know.
think so.
But anyway,
Dogs
it's got
are
you
very
all
sensible.
talking. So, as I said, we are a nation of animal lovers. So it's certainly got you all talking this morning. Clive agrees with me, said, should drivers automatically run over cats and dogs if they get in the way? No, that would be a hit and run.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. But I think when has it ever been the case that a cat or a dog has stopped, has been sort of a just stop oil style movement? I think that we should be as rough with the swan that held up the train yesterday as we should be with just stop oil protesters.
Well, some would argue we're not rough enough with those either.
Yes, no, I think absolutely, just a more forceful mobility idea. But Steve wrote in to say something interesting, because we mentioned how crowns were, how swans were the property of the king, but not all swans. What was your
wild ones?
Wild swans. But how do you know which one's a wild swan and which one's not? How do you know which is a royal swan and which one not? Well, Steve has written in to say crown swans have yellow leg tags. Private swans have white tags. So I suppose we shouldn't touch it if it has a yellow tag.
You couldn't.
Because that's His Majesty's property, and I think I would be put up in the tower.
Yeah, so I used to think that you could get done for treason if you killed a swan. That's not particularly true.
I think you probably, I'm fairly sure that you could statutorily be done for treason,
yes,
but it just wouldn't be prosecuted.
You can serve time.
Yeah.
You can, in theory, serve time, and you can get
in the same
fine.
way that I think, where is it you're allowed to fire a crossbow at a Welshman in some city or whatever? There are lots of laws that sort of aren't really enforced.
No, not really. But still, you wouldn't want to mess with the swan, that's for sure. And Claire agrees with me and says, I agree with Ellie. You have to protect the swans. The train was delayed for an hour. It's not that much, really. We have to look after our swans. Shelley, swans are living animals. They have a right to be on the planet as much as humans.
But not on the tracks. They have a right to be on the planet, but they don't have a right to be on the tracks of a railway.
Well,
look, I think you've definitely won the inbox today.
I think you have.
I recognise I'm in a minority on this one.
Generally, I feel like I'm very in sync with the viewers, and you'll find this. I say things...
Insignificant? No, that doesn't quite work.
But do keep your views coming in. GBNews at gbnews.com.
This is Britain's Newsroom, and we will be talking about more than just swans. There are some big, important stories today, too. For example, the deadline for people to obtain their first and second dose of this COVID-19 vaccine is today. It ends today, this whole programme.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, really, isn't it? Well, the government are urging people who are unvaccinated to come forward.
And after today, people will only be able to get a first or second dose of vaccine if they are of an increased risk to the virus. So it'll only be the vulnerable groups. In many ways, this marks sort of the end of what the government might have considered to be the pandemic period. They've finally caught up with the rest of us.
Well, this year's spring booster campaign also ends today, affecting adults aged 75 and over, care home residents and people with a suppressed immune system.
Well, let's get more on this now with the GP, Dr. Lawrence Buckman. And Dr. Buckman, thank you for joining us this morning. I think a lot of people might be a little bit confused as to the NHS vaccine programme still going on. Of course, it was for vulnerable groups, but it was for others as well.
It was until tomorrow. And from tomorrow, the routine vaccination of not at-risk adults stops. And we'll still be vaccinating other people, the at-risk, but not everybody else. And that moves it from being a special vaccine campaign that has run for years now to something that is special for those patients who require it.
Oh, that seems fairly sensible to me.
Yeah. So does this mark the end of the pandemic?
Yes, I think it depends how you call the word pandemic, but I think this is absolutely the final straw for the pandemic. That doesn't mean COVID has gone away. It doesn't mean it doesn't kill people, but it now moves into the category of dangerous illnesses, many of which we have wrestled with for generations. So it's now moved into the background rather than the foreground of health service thinking.
And in its wake, I suppose, the NHS has a lot of problems. We've been hearing today about the government's plans to try and boost the workforce. We know we've heard endless stories about the waiting lists, the delayed treatments. I suppose this sort of is a bit of a line in the sand today, putting that pandemic period behind us. But it means there are a hell of a lot of problems for the NHS to deal with in the months and years to come.
There were always going to be problems after the pandemic. That was guaranteed. It was obvious, however you handle the pandemic. The way the government handled it is the way they've done it. We can't change history. So we just have to say the consequences of their decisions we are now all living with. And that means that there are still people with COVID. There are still people dying of COVID, although the numbers are actually quite small. And there are still people in intensive care who get COVID. But those numbers are now not hugely different from anybody else. And the committee that decides these things, which is an independent committee for vaccination and immunisation, they've said now we have to move on to a normal footing for COVID. And actually, it's about time that happened.
And looking back at the COVID vaccination programme, I mean, whatever you think about the vaccines and the way that they were rolled out, it was fast, wasn't it? And we were world leading at the time.
At the beginning, we certainly were. Speaking as one of the vaccinators at 2 degrees outside, I can tell you it's jolly cold when you're huddling around the vaccine to get warm. It's very difficult, but we processed and supported thousands of patients and working at really quite fast, which is, again, is difficult when it's 2 degrees. But you can, and we did. And we did that because we realised that COVID is deadly and protecting yourself is very important. And I'm pleased we did. So the rollout was very fast, and that's all to the credit of the government.
Well, I suppose this is a moment for us to reflect upon a pretty torrid couple of years, a lot of government mistakes, but also some striking successes. That logistical operation of getting so many people, particularly vulnerable people, vaccinated quite so quickly. Dr. Lawrence Buckman, I suppose, thank you for your service in being part of that team, and thank you for speaking to us on Britain's Newsroom here on GB News today.
Thank you. Thanks. It is, as you say, a line in the sand, is it not? I mean, imagine back in summer of 2020 being told that in 3 years' time we'd be at the end.
It was by the time that we got round to our 3rd lockdown that I was thinking, is this going to be forever? When is this going to end? Are we going to be talking about this in 2030? But no, it does feel nice to sort of be able to talk about it all in the past tense.
Yeah, it does. It makes a difference, doesn't it? Well, stay with us. Still lots more to come, including Paris is burning as anger over police fatally shooting a teenager reaches boiling point. We will cross live to the French capital. That's after your morning news with Rhiannon.
Ellie, thank you. Good morning. It's 10:33. Your top stories from the GB Newsroom. And we start with some breaking news for you. A boy who's believed to be 15 years old and a 23-year-old man have been stabbed to death in Islington in North London. The Met Police says the incident happened last night, and we'll bring you more on this developing story as we get it. The government's launching what's being described as the most radical modernisation and reform of the NHS in its history. Ahead of the 75th anniversary of the Health Service, the 15-year plan will aim to plug shortages of over 300,000 staff in England. With £2.4 billion worth of funding over 5 years, it focuses on retaining and training new staff, as well as adopting advanced technologies like AI. Lord Zac Goldsmith has resigned from government a day after the Tory minister was named in a Privileges Committee report for interfering in Boris Johnson's Partygate probe. In his resignation letter, Lord Goldsmith accused the government of apathy on climate change, saying it made his role as Minister for International Environment untenable. He also claims Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is uninterested in the environment. Households in the UK will pay less for their gas and electricity from tomorrow, but bills will remain higher than they were before the energy crisis. A new price cap set by the regulator Ofgem comes into effect this weekend. It'll see households with typical energy usage pay £2,074. However, bills will remain a lot higher than they were 2 years ago, £800 more expensive. The Duke of Sussex's lawsuit against Mirror Group newspapers over allegations of phone hacking is due to conclude today. The trial's over alleged unlawful information gathering between 1996 and 2011. The Mirror Group denies any wrongdoing. And you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2617 and €1.1638. The price of gold is £1,508.96 per ounce, and the FTSE 100's at 7,509 points.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News, investments that matter.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's 10:40. You're with Britain's Newsroom on GB News with Tom Howard and Ellie Costello.
And hundreds of people have been arrested in France as rioting and looting continues across the country. It's been going on for days now.
Yes, 40,000 police officers were deployed as anger over a police shooting that killed a 17-year-old boy on Tuesday reached boiling point.
But let's get more live from Paris now with journalist David Chazan. And David, we're expecting more violence over this weekend. The French authorities just haven't been able to put a lid on this.
No, and that was despite deploying 40,000 police officers across the country last night. And what we saw was, rather than a calming down, we saw an intensification of violence. It spread to more cities in the country. I think, although we haven't got an official tally of it yet, but there seems to have been more damage done, more shops smashed up and vandalised and looted as well, and certainly a lot more arrests, more than 600 over the country and more than 300 in Paris alone. Now, here in the Paris area where I am, the violence was previously limited to the sort of blue-collar, mainly immigrant suburbs of Paris, where you get rows and rows of tower blocks. They're not at all what we think of as suburbs in the UK. But last night, there were worrying signs for Parisians that the violence was beginning to move into the heart of the city, where we saw shops vandalised on the Rue de Rivoli, just a few minutes walk from the Louvre Museum. So it's getting worse and it's spreading.
Yes, and I mean, this isn't going to die down anytime soon, is it? Because what we're talking about here is also racial tensions. I mean, what we know about this 17-year-old boy is he's from a French-Algerian family. His mother says that he was shot lethally by a police officer as he drove away from a traffic stop. But she says he'd been stopped 5 or 6 times in the past 2 years. She feels as though he had been picked upon by police officers because of the colour of his skin.
Yeah, and that's certainly the feeling of most people in the ethnic communities. But I do have to say that he was only 17. You can't get a driving licence in France until the age of 18. So whatever else happened, he was driving illegally. But one thing that's particularly angered people is that initially the police version of events was that the officer discharged his firearm because the car that the teenager was in was being driven at speed towards him and his colleague. But then mobile phone footage, which happened to have been filmed by a bystander, emerged, which seems to completely contradict the police version. It shows the two officers standing to the side of the vehicle. It's stationary. One of them is pointing his gun at the youth. Then you see the car pulling away and you hear a shot being fired. Now, last night, the police officer's lawyer, because this officer is now in prison awaiting trial on murder charges, his lawyer said that he had said sorry. That he was sorry for the teenager's death and he was sorry for the family, but nevertheless he was sticking to his argument that he did the right thing, that he had to fire because there was potential danger either to him and to his colleague or to members of the public. But the public prosecutor has said that the evidence he's obtained so far from his preliminary inquiry appears to indicate that the conditions for a legal use of the officer's weapon were not met.
No one comes out of this well. The police officer whose story was evidently less than truthful, the rioters who are looting and burning cities across Paris, but also the French president, who himself has come under some criticism for, while cities were on fire, Emmanuel Macron was attending an Elton John concert.
Well, that's right. So he's inevitably faced criticism, particularly from right-wing politicians who say it's not a good look for the president to be photographed with Elton John and his wife Brigitte and Elton John's husband David Furnish on a night when many suburbs around the country are going up in flames and there's such awful violence. Now, President Macron has also come under fire for his initial reaction to this shooting when he described it as inexcusable and incomprehensible. And right-wing politicians then jumped on him and said that it wasn't his role to judge whether the police officer was guilty or not, and that in France you're always innocent until proven guilty. So they criticised him for that. Now they're criticising him for just seeming to go about his life as normal, as if nothing much were going on.
Well, David Chasson, thank you so much for comprehensively taking us through that story. No doubt it's going to go on, and it's one we will return to on Britain's Newsroom. But for now, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Yeah, and I would be concerned about my safety if I were in the Parisian suburbs this weekend. I mean,
or indeed, as he was saying, closer into the centre.
Yeah.
Closer into the centre.
Because it does look set to continue over the weekend. Really horrific scenes of cars being burnt out and shops being looted. Let's hope that Macron can get a grip of things sooner rather than later. Right. Here in Britain, let's have a look at today's newspapers, shall we? And we're pleased now to be joined by Conservative peer Lord Daniel Moylan and Emma Burnell to discuss the latest headlines. Let's run you through some of them this morning. Grounded hog day for Rishi. See what they did there? So that's on the Metro. Judges concluded that Rwanda is not safe for Channel migrants to be sent to.
And does Sir Andy have one more ace up his sleeve, the Telegraph asks, as the double Wimbledon champion warms up ahead of his battle for the big title?
Oh, I hope so. It'd be good to see him win again. The Daily Mail lead as well on the Rwanda court ruling. We should decide who comes here, not criminal gangs, their front page says.
And blueprint boost to boost the NHS workforce by 20,000, says The Times. That's, of course, we've been talking about today.
Big news for the NHS this morning. That's what the Daily Express is leading with. Rishi's radical plan to fix the NHS once and for all.
And mortgage deals are hiked again as big six banks raise their prices. That's the front page of The Eye.
The Financial Times headline reads, record withdrawals from banks as British households tap into savings.
Well, let's discuss some of these stories now. Lord Moylan is here, as is Emma Burnell. And let's start with you, Lord Moylan. What story have you picked out?
Well, we're starting, I think, with the Court of Appeal's decision about the Rwanda deportations. and it's gone against the government by a majority of 2 to 1. They will appeal. They'll appeal on the current facts, but they could also, in the meantime, I don't know what they're going to do, but they could also try and improve the arrangements they've agreed with Rwanda and strengthen them that would address some of the concerns of the court. I think what it illustrates to me, though, and probably heresy to say this, is the sort of randomness of court decisions. Government wins in the Court of Appeal, and then you go to...
in the High Court?
In the High Court. Then you go to the Court of Appeal and you win 2-1 on a sort of toss-up, where they're not disagreeing, these judges, about the law. They're disagreeing about sort of marginal interpretations of the facts. And then it will go to the Supreme Court, apparently. They're going to do that. And earlier on your programme, you had a KC saying that nobody knows what the Supreme Court could decide. 50-50. Could go either way. So there's a sort of random element to this that I think is quite frustrating for government, but also frustrating for people. And they don't understand why, it's like tossing rolling dice rather than settling the law sometimes.
What do you think of the decision, Emma?
I think judges judge, and that is their role. Their role is to interpret the law. They will have the reason there's 3 of them doing it is because they do need to discuss that and decide between them, come to a majority decision. Sometimes that's a complete, 3-0. Sometimes it's not. But the law is in judgment and interpretation. That is our system. It's always been our system. Well, I say always, in modern times. I think the problem politically that the government has is that they had all of their eggs in this one basket. Sunak promised at the beginning of the year, and when you make pledges on the 1st of January, you're essentially expected to deliver them by the 31st of December, even if you don't put a timetable on them, that he would stop the boats. Now, it may well be that in December, when we're in cold weather and there will be smaller numbers, but I don't think anyone, whether they are incredibly in favour of the Rwanda plan or, as I am, find it, really quite troubling, thinks that the boats will be stopped this year. And part of the problem is that they haven't done all the other bits of work that could have been done because they must have known that this was a possibility.
No, what the government might say to that is that they are hiring more processors, and they have done this new deal with France. They're creating this sort of detention centre near Calais, which British taxpayers are paying for. But they might say that they're doing these other bits as well.
There are small other bits, but the backlog is going up, not down. And ultimately, that's the facts. The facts of the case are they are not dealing with the backlog. They are not stopping the boats. I don't want to see people coming across in dangerous vessels. I'm a liberal. I believe in a fairly liberal asylum policy, but people are dying in the English Channel. And that's not something anybody would want to see. Now, I would argue that one of the ways to stop that is to have better, safe and legal routes. Other people will disagree, and that is a perfectly legitimate discussion in a democracy. But I think that not doing enough of anything and putting all your eggs on a policy that you yourself described as pushing the boundaries of the law, so therefore new would be subject to legal challenge, is a real problem.
OK, Emma, let's stick with you, shall we? And something that perhaps Rishi Sunak would prefer that we talk about. It's a very embarrassing day for him yesterday. He'd like us to look at this NHS reform, which is the biggest in its history. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I'm here as a Labour supporter, the left-wing edge of the platform, and I think it's a good plan. I don't believe in dismissing something simply because it's proposed by a Conservative government. I very much look forward to a Labour government delivering it, but that's a different matter.
That is what is so interesting, isn't it? Because it seems to be uniting people, sorry, Tom, across the board, whatever political party you're from.
The NHS workforce has clearly been struggling for a long time. We have huge problems with retention. We have had problems with recruitment. There are real issues with pay and not just pay, because we always talk about pay when we talk about the strikes and everything, but conditions, and conditions being particularly hard, and that being so off-putting and having people leave. The thing that I would point out is that we need an equal amount of emphasis going on social care, because you will not fix the NHS without fixing social care.
Well, Lord Moylan, let's bring you in on this one, because is this the Conservative Party just delivering a Labour Party policy? Is it right to describe this as the biggest reform of the NHS in its history?
Well, it's never right to talk about the biggest reform of the NHS in its history, because the next one is always the biggest, and it's very easy to fall into hyperbole.
It is what they said in 2012, wasn't it?
But the fact is, as Emma says, it is sensible to look forward and make an estimate of the sort of workforce that the NHS is going to need. And because people need training, so you can plan for that. And the truth is, we have become far too dependent on hiring people from abroad, and we should be training more people here, and we won't do that unless we have some sort of plan for it. So the idea that now, whether this is the right plan in detail, I wouldn't know, and I haven't looked at it, and I wouldn't know how to run a hospital and how many staff you need here doing this and that. But having a plan seems to me a sensible idea and doesn't actually belong to Labour or Conservative, and the fact that it belongs to both is quite encouraging.
I wonder if this undermines...
The plan might be delivered.
I wonder if this undermines slightly the Conservatives' argument for the last 3 or 4 years, saying we've got X thousand more nurses, we've got X thousand more doctors, which is true, there have been a lot more doctors, but I suppose they're now admitting that even though there have been lots more and billions more poured into this service, it's still not enough.
Well, it'll never be enough in the NHS, and the fact is putting more money into public services that are already very well funded generally doesn't produce better outcomes. And this is a lesson we've got to learn in this country. It isn't that you put money into something and you get better cancer survival rates, for example, which is an outcome. You might get more nurses and doctors, that might be a good thing, but that's an intermediate point. The purpose of the NHS is not to employ more people, it's to get better outcomes for health.
And some of these things that Rishi Sunak
things are not delivered simply by pouring more money into the NHS.
Some of the things that Rishi Sunak is suggesting actually might save money and deliver better outcomes. This idea to use AI to detect cancer that the human eye can't see, that could be something that saves on money, saves on, I suppose, the need for people, and actually delivers better outcomes.
Yeah, so there are interesting planks to this. The reliance on technology, the changing certain technologies, and from basic things like phone systems at GPs to really high complex things that I don't understand at all, like AI and cancer screenings. I mean, I can basically understand a phone system. But yeah, I think there are lots of interesting parts to this. It will be interesting to see how it's implemented.
OK, Emma, Lord Moylan, really good to see you both. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Well, in the next few moments, could Diet Coke cause cancer? Or is it all a load of baloney? Well, we'll get the answer here in the next hour. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hi then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my new show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m, where real people get to meet those in power and hold them to account. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country in the real world. Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in their home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now? Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 11 a.m. here on GB News, on Britain's Newsroom. This is the 30th of June. My name's Tom Harwood and I'm with Ellie Costello for this new programme.
Yeah, lots coming up on the programme for you today. Number 10 continues its battle over the Rwanda deportations following yesterday's ruling by the courts that they are unlawful.
And could women who take hormone replacement therapy have an increased risk of dementia? Well, we'll speak to an expert on it.
More Tory turmoil as Zac Goldsmith quits the government, saying the PM isn't interested in the environment.
And a sweetener used in Diet Coke and chewing gum could be carcinogenic, according to the World Health Organization. Or is that as simple as it sounds? Well, we'll have the answer.
This is a new programme on a Friday morning, Britain's Newsroom, with you until 12 p.m. Esther and Phil will be back with you at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with Saturday Morning Live. And do get in touch with us today on any of the stories that we're talking about, gbviews@gbnews.com. We do love to hear from you. But first of all, let's get the news bulletin with Rhiannon.
Ellie, thank you. Good morning. It's 1 minute past 11. Your top stories from the GB Newsroom. The government's launching what's being described as the most radical modernisation and reform of the NHS in its history. Ahead of the 75th anniversary of the health service, the 15-year plan will aim to plug shortages of over 300,000 staff in England. With £2.4 billion worth of funding over 5 years, it focuses on retaining and training staff, as well as adopting advanced technologies like AI. Health Secretary Steve Barclay told us reform like this has been a long time coming.
It's so we can get those waiting lists down, so we can ensure that we get the treatment, the extra capacity into the system. But what today is also about is responding to something the NHS has asked for many years, which is to have a long-term plan. It will be iterative, it's not a one-off. We'll keep coming back to it and working on it in terms of as the modelling evolves.
While Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting says it's taken too long to implement the measures.
why do we need the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history? Why do we have such an understaffed NHS? It's because over the last 13 years, we've not had a workforce plan. It is the biggest expansion since the last Labour government, which delivered 75,000 more nurses and 44,000 more doctors.
Zach Goldsmith has resigned from government a day after the Tory minister was named in a Privileges Committee report for interfering in Boris Johnson's Partygate probe. It's understood he was asked to apologise for his alleged role to undermine the investigation. In his resignation letter, Lord Goldsmith accuses the government of apathy on climate change, saying it made his role as Minister for International Environment untenable. He also claims Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is uninterested in the environment. And more on that breaking news story we broke earlier. Police have launched a double murder investigation after a teenager and a 23-year-old man was stabbed in Islington in North London last night. A third victim was also found with a stab wound. His condition isn't thought to be life-threatening. No arrests have been made, and we'll get you more on that as we get it. Households in the UK will pay less for their gas and electricity from tomorrow, but bills will remain higher than they were before the energy crisis. A new price cap set by the regulator Ofgem comes into effect this weekend. It'll see households with typical energy usage pay £2,074. That's a fall of £426 a year. However, bills will remain a lot higher than they were 2 years ago, £800 more expensive. That's almost double. The Duke of Sussex's lawsuit against Mirror Group newspapers over allegations of phone hacking is due to conclude today. The trial is over alleged unlawful information gathering between 1996 and 2011. The Mirror Group denies any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, a court has been told Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey is a sexual bully who delights in making others feel uncomfortable. Prosecutors described the Hollywood star as a man who sexually assaults other men. At the start of a 4-week trial at Southwark Crown Court, the actor's facing 12 charges of sex offences against 4 men, which allegedly took place between 2001 and 2013. Mr. Spacey denies all of the charges against him. In France, President Emmanuel Macron is holding a second crisis meeting following the worst night of rioting yet over the police shooting of a teenager. More than 650 people were arrested and 40,000 officers deployed across the country as clashes continued. For a third night, vehicles were torched and supermarkets reportedly looted during the violence. Protesters are demanding justice for the 17-year-old, known only as Nahel M, who was shot when he failed to stop his car in Nanterre on Tuesday. 16 million Brits will, from tomorrow, be able to live and work in Australia after the age limit for working holiday visas is raised from 30 to 35. The visa duration will also be extended from 2 to 3 years without the need for consecutive stays or farm work. The free trade agreement between the two countries enables similar arrangements for Australians to work and travel here in the UK. And the King will receive a special sword named the Elizabeth when he visits Edinburgh next week. King Charles will be presented with the sword before a service of thanksgiving at St Giles's Cathedral on Wednesday. The Elizabeth, inspired by thistles and Scotland's landscape, replaces the deteriorating Sword of State. And very beautiful it is too. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's back over to Ellie and Tom.
Well, thanks for that, Rhiannon, and welcome, everyone, to Britain's Newsroom with Tom and Ellie. We've been really enjoying this show so far today. It's quite a busy news day. It's a good, strong start to what is every Friday now on GB News, Britain's Newsroom. And we've also been particularly enjoying you getting in touch. And I have to say, Leslie, thank you so much for your message saying how great to see Ellie and Tom together today, our two favourite presenters. Knowledgeable, intelligent and so professional respectful as well as friendly and polite.
Aww.
More of them, please. So
Who's that, Leslie?
Leslie,
Well,
yeah.
Leslie, thank you very much. That's very, very kind. And we hope that you really enjoy the show. It's new to us as well as to you, but the plan is it's called Britain's Newsroom because we want to cover the stories that matter to you, and we also want to hear from you. And a lot of what we want to talk about is your views, your opinions, the biggest stories that are taking place in Britain. Having said that, one of the biggest stories to
What a
us
lead-in.
today...
What a lead-in.
But aside from the NHS and, of course, Rwanda and all the really top stories
Government
going on today,
resignation.
Government resignation, you're right.
What we've been focusing on...
Is a swan.
Not focusing on. What we've been touching upon is a swan.
Is a swan.
Yeah.
Got its way onto the Elizabeth Line tracks yesterday. It suspended the entire Elizabeth Line for over an hour. Passengers were stuck on trains for over an hour without a loo, in some cases. I was saying that's right because they're protected animals and you've got to be careful with the swans.
And I think that maybe potentially hundreds of people, probably thousands, probably tens of thousands of people. I don't think that's an exaggeration, actually.
No, I
if you
don't
look at
think
the
it is.
frequency of the train being disrupted for one swan, I think that that's an imbalance.
So Tom thinks we should have run over the swan. I think that is awful. Jeff says, the trouble is, Tom, unfortunately, swans cannot read the signs regarding trespassing on the line, which is a fantastic point.
Yeah, Jeff, you're right. The swans can't read the signs. It's for, I said a little earlier, well, can't we keep them off the tracks? I'm just thinking of practicable solutions to avoid stopping a train that's meant to run every couple of minutes being delayed for over an hour. I don't think we've reached a solution yet. And Jeff, you're right, signs wouldn't work. But I just don't think we can let swans just wander about tracks at their own accord. Beautiful creatures, but I mean, my gosh, can we not find a solution here? GBviews at gbnews.com. Let's fix Britain.
Yeah, what should have been done about the swan? And to be honest, I don't think the swan wanted to be there either, to be fair. So it's best just to be shooed away, as I said, in peace, not being run over. But of course, aside from the swans, it's been a very big day in news. It's been a big day in politics as well, hasn't it?
It has. The Prime Minister is launching what's being described as the most radical reform of the NHS in the service's history.
The 15-year plan will aim to plug shortages of up to 360,000 staff and save taxpayers £10 billion.
Well, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, says that the NHS has been calling for a long-term plan like the one the government is unveiling today for some time.
It's so we can get those waiting lists down, so we can ensure that we get the treatment, the extra capacity into the system. But what today is also about is responding to something the NHS has asked for many years, which is to have a long-term plan. It will be iterative, it's not a one-off. We'll keep coming back to it and working on it in terms of as the modelling evolves.
But Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting said the government should have taken action long ago.
Why do we need the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history? Why do we have such an understaffed NHS? It's because over the last 13 years, we've not had a workforce plan. It is the biggest expansion since the last Labour government, which delivered 75,000 more nurses and 44,000 more doctors.
Well, despite the criticisms, the NHS announcement is a welcome distraction for the government, perhaps, after suffering a blow to their Rwanda policy.
Yes, yesterday the High Court deemed the policy unlawful, but Downing Street insists it will appeal that ruling.
Conservative MPs have called for a plan B to tackle the small boats crisis, as the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, told MPs the court's decision is disappointing for the majority of the British people.
Well, we're joined now by UK Director of More in Common, Luke Trill. Really good to see you this morning, Luke. Thank you so much for your company. I just wanted to ask you about the Home Secretary's comments. Suella Braverman telling MPs yesterday that this was disappointing for the majority of British people. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, I think public attitudes to the Rwanda policy are more nuanced than we're often led to believe. To start with, there is no doubt that right across the public, people want channel crossings to be stopped. They think they're unfair, they think that they empower people smugglers, and they don't like the fact that we don't seem to have control over our borders. If you ask them about the Rwanda policy directly in a poll, what will tend to come out is that more people support it than not. But we've never had a majority in public polling say that they support the plan. And then if you ask them the second question, which is, do you think this plan will work? Usually you get quite a big majority saying they don't think it will. So there's a lot of different facets. People want the boats to stop, more say they support Rwanda than don't, but then say it won't work. And interestingly, when you ask people about, should we be deporting genuine refugees to Rwanda, then the public say no. So when they get into the details of the plan, they actually like it a lot less.
It's interesting, people making that distinction there between economic migrants who they believe should be deported versus genuine refugees who they don't. But Luke, I know you've done so much polling and you've done focus groups around this. I want to ask you about something that went a little viral on social media last night and this morning, which is the BBC Question Time audience. They were asked, does anyone at all support this policy? No one in that audience put up their hand. That doesn't sound like it matches with the polling you've been doing. My question is the audience unrepresentative on that programme? Or is there some sort of other effect going on here, social embarrassment or something about what people feel when they're asked to put up their hand in public?
Yeah, it's a good question. And as I said, people, when they get into the details of the Rwanda policy, have concerns. But when we in a focus group or in a poll ask that straight question, we would never get that sort of resounding silence for people being in favour of the Rwanda policy. And I think there are two reasons that you hinted at why that question time audience doesn't quite capture the public mood. Firstly, what's known as social desirability bias, the sense that actually you don't want to put your hand up and back something that you think other people might judge you for. So I suspect there were some shy supporters of the policy there. And then the second thing is you have to remember that even though Question Time tries really hard to get a politically balanced audience, they are much more highly engaged than the average voter. Most average voters don't want to sit and watch a politics show for 2 hours. I'm sorry to say this to the two of you. So they're getting people who are generally kind of more highly engaged, and that tends to make them slightly more liberal as well. So those two reasons meant, I know lots of people saw it and were like, wow, everyone hates the policy. It's not quite true. And actually campaigners would be better focusing on the fact that people don't want to see, for instance, victims of modern slavery, women, children being deported to Rwanda. They want us to clamp down on economic migrants and, crucially, people smugglers.
Luke Trill, really good to see you this morning. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Well, let's move on to this other big story that is affecting Rishi Sunak today. Perhaps it's not the best intro he has this morning, but allies of Boris Johnson have come under fire from the Privileges Committee with a report accusing them of improper pressure on MPs investigating Partygate.
Yes, 7 MPs and 3 peers were named in the report, with the committee suggesting they could potentially be in contempt of Parliament.
And one of those peers was, of course, Lord Goldsmith, Zac Goldsmith, who announced today he's resigning from the government. Might this report be something to do with that decision?
Well, perhaps. Let's get the view of senior political correspondent at The Guardian, Aubrey Allegretti. Really good to see you this morning, Aubrey. Thank you for your time. What do you think the reaction has been from those 7 MPs and the 3 peers that were named? Do you think it has anything to do with Zac Goldsmith's resignation this morning, being named in that report?
Frankly, Boris Johnson's allies are sort of blisteringly angry at having been named in this report. They think that the Privileges Committee has committed a huge overreach, that it is sort of proving all of their preconceived ideas about a bias against not just Boris Johnson, but those who've supported him for the last few years correct. And there is the very interesting question of Zac Goldsmith, because unlike the other 9 people who are named in the report, he is still a serving government minister. He was kept on by Rishi Sunak when he took over as Prime Minister in October last year, and that was partly seen as a sort of sop to Boris Johnson. It was important for Rishi Sunak to have some of Boris Johnson's old allies around the cabinet table and in the ministerial ranks to keep them on side. But it does seem that Zac Goldsmith was one of those people who cast huge questions about the impunity of the committee, and from the discussions I've had this morning with Number 10, was told in no uncertain terms, you have to apologise for this. You're a serving government minister. What you say represents the government's position, and so you're going to have to retract your statement. He, it seems, hasn't done so, and a Number 10 person said had come up with another excuse to resign. Obviously, Zac Goldsmith would disagree, and I think would say that for a long time he's been a very ardent champion of environmental issues. It sounds like maybe this decision has been at the back of his mind for a while. So he has been casting a criticism of Rishi Sunak for not pursuing environmental policies, basically saying you're very indifferent to them.
This is an interesting point that you're raising here, that there was almost this ultimatum given to Zac Goldsmith. Apologise for... I don't think he was ever particularly rude. He's quite a polite guy, but he did question the propriety of that committee. So apologise for that or resign. That's basically the ultimatum that Rishi Sunak gave him yesterday, despite Rishi Sunak's spokesperson saying that he wasn't going to get involved.
Yeah, it's been difficult. Number 10 obviously stood by Zac Goldsmith yesterday when we were asking them repeatedly, do you have full confidence in your Environment Minister? We were told categorically the answer was yes. But you have to look at what Zac Goldsmith said, and he shared a tweet which essentially called the inquiry a witch hunt in a kangaroo court. And he said exactly this: there was only ever going to be one outcome and the evidence was totally irrelevant to it. So he was at complete odds with the government official line on the Privileges Committee inquiry. Number 10's official line has been, we thank them for their work and we sort of agree, or at least don't quibble with any of their findings. Zac Goldsmith going off completely in the opposite direction. He was, of course, given a peerage by Boris Johnson when he first became Prime Minister, so he is somewhat indebted to him and they're very close allies, so it's maybe not surprising that Zac Goldsmith thinks this, but it is surprising that he was allowed to say it as a government minister without any kind of repercussion from the government until, it seems, last night.
And Aubrey, what do you think will happen next here? Because this committee, they didn't recommend a sanction for the MPs and the peers that were named in this report. That's going to go to a vote on Monday. How likely do you think it is that they will be suspended from the House over this?
So the sort of contents of the vote we haven't exactly seen yet. All we know is that on Monday, the 10th of July, there's going to be a debate on a motion about this report, and it will ask basically to do three things. First of all, to note and endorse the report, which obviously criticises lots of Boris Johnson's allies. Second of all, to basically reaffirm that if you try to impugn the integrity of this committee or interfere in its processes while it's conducting a live investigation, then they want to make categorically crystal clear you are yourself committing a contempt of Parliament. So it's a bit hard to sort of retrospectively apply that to the 10 Tories in this instance. And the third thing the report's going to do is basically try and make a strong point to the House of Lords, which the Commons, of course, can't interfere in, and say, if you're a peer, then we want you to know that you can't interfere in our processes as well. So I think the whole issue, Number 10 hopes, can finally have a line drawn in the sand about a week on Monday. The question is really how much Boris Johnson's allies want to carry on agitating in order to protect their own name, because they're obviously very unhappy at the extent to which this committee has criticised them and, in their view, overreached.
Well, clearly the Prime Minister wants to draw a line under this. He's got just over a week to do so, although the history of this long saga has perhaps shown up some more twists and turns than the Prime Minister would have liked. Let's see what happens a week on Monday. Aubrey Allegretti, thank you so much for joining us here on Britain's Newsroom.
Now, Birmingham City Council has been plunged into chaos after a £650 million bill for equal pay claims emerged.
The bill is equivalent to the council's entire annual spending on services, and it's growing by up to £14 million every month.
Well, Jack Carson joins us live now from Birmingham. Well, this is chaos, isn't it, Jack?
Yeah, so just to provide some context as to where these equal pay claims have come from, this spans back from a 2012 settlement and a Supreme Court ruling where it's found that hundreds of mostly female employees had missed out on historic bonuses such as teaching assistants, cleaners. They'd been discriminated against, it found, against more male-dominated roles such as street cleaners and refuse collectors. Now, since that ruling, the council has paid out £1.1 billion in these claims, but over the past year the council has also been implementing a new financial and database system that is over budget, but this new analysis has found that this is a 650 million to 760 million pound black hole that the council still hasn't paid in these equal pay claims. Now, the leader of the opposition on this council, Councillor Robert Alden, and leader of the local Conservatives, said that the council have known about this issue for a while.
And we're really concerned about the impact it could have on those most vulnerable people in the city. And that's why we're calling on the council to now start coming clean about what they're considering, what the impact's going to be, and work with opposition groups on the council to actually try and get this resolved, because we've been warning them about what the issues are, but the Birmingham Labour Cabinet refused to listen, and now Birmingham taxpayers are going to be paying the price for years to come of their failure. Even Labour Cabinet members were tweeting that they felt there was an issue, but they didn't do anything about it. And to put it into context, it's like your neighbour stopping you and telling you you've got a broken tile on your roof, but instead of fixing the roof, you just hope it doesn't rain. And that's what the Labour Council's done here. They've hoped the problem would go away, and now Birmingham taxpayers are being hit with a £760 million bill because of it. People looking at Birmingham will be worried about exactly what a Labour government would do in this country if they keep repeating the kind of behaviour we've seen here in Birmingham, where they're running up bills, unable to pay them, leaving valuable services that are needed by vulnerable people at risk.
Well, the council say that given the huge sums involved, the council say it can't afford to pay this from its existing budget or resources, and they remain on ongoing discussions with the government to try and find a solution.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for bringing us that story from a very windy Birmingham today. Although I have to say, I think that was that Birmingham Town Hall behind him, which is a beautiful building. We need more.
Beautiful.
A lot of town halls in this country are not as pretty as they should be, and Birmingham gets it right.
Tom really likes pretty buildings. We should learn this about him. Earlier on, we were talking about courts, and you were saying all the courts in the land should just be really beautiful, and it should be decreed that
we were looking at that video of Kevin Spacey walking into what looked like some sort of dingy 1960s concrete monstrosity. Yeah. Awful. No, it should be glorious and pillared and pedimented with metopes and I
agree with you. No, it's very passionately. Let us know what you think about or any of the stories we're talking about today. GBNews at gbnews.com. But do stay with us, because this is very worrying news for someone like me who loves Diet Coke and other beverages, I should say.
Other beverages are available.
Yes, but these low-calorie drinks, they could be carcinogenic. We're going to be talking about that next.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com? You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, it's just coming up to 11:30, and this is Britain's Newsroom on GB News with me, Tom Harwood, and Ellie Costello.
Yeah, we're talking about all of the top stories in Britain today. We're also talking about the smaller ones, but they're the ones that get you talking more often than not. We're talking about a swan that made its way onto the Elizabeth line yesterday, suspended the entire line for over an hour. It meant that some people were on trains without loos for over an hour. And we had a bit of a disagreement, didn't we, about how you deal with this?
Look, I just think it's pathetic that the fifth richest country in the world, a country that's just completed this shining new tribute to Her late Majesty, the Elizabeth line, the £15 billion Elizabeth line, and it's all held up by one swan.
Well, I was saying they're protected species, so, you can't mess with the swan, but lots of you have been getting in touch.
I am really interested what Dell from Barry Island has written in to say. He says, "Hi, Tom. I've worked on the railways for over 32 years, and yes, dogs and cats are silly enough to stray onto the railway line and get squashed regularly. And to me, I'm more upset about a dog getting squashed than a swan. I would put a dog as higher up the pecking order, for want of a better term, if we're talking about avian animals, than a swan."
Well, you don't like the idea of any animals being squashed. But Steve's been in touch and given us an answer, because this is one of the best things about GB News and GB News, is people get in touch and actually give us the answers. It's like a boomerang. We ask something, it comes back.
Conversation.
Yes, exactly. Steve says it's because swans wild swans, as we established earlier, belong to the king. They are protected, and therefore the drivers have no choice but to stop. It's in the rules.
So while a driver is allowed to run over a dog, they're not allowed to run over a swan.
Yeah.
I think that's the wrong way round.
Yeah.
I think His Majesty would want them to run over the swan. Not because that's a nice thing to do, but because the line in question was the tribute to his late mother, and it should not be stopped. It should be allowed to run.
Well, he's an animal lover, isn't he? So I don't think he'd like the idea of anyone being squashed. But do get in touch on that story or any of the stories that we're talking about this morning. gbnews@gbnews.com. We do love to hear from you.
Well, moving on to something slightly more serious now, the use of hormone replacement therapy to ease the effects of the menopause has been linked to a higher risk of dementia in a new study.
Yes, the nationwide study from Denmark tracked over 60,000 women and found those who took HRT had a 24% higher risk of a dementia diagnosis, which increased during the duration of the treatment.
Well, let's get to the bottom of this now with the top UK hormone specialist, Professor Anis Mukherjee. Anis, thank you for joining us this morning, because this is a very concerning story, particularly for a lot of women who will be thinking, gosh, I'm on HRT or want to be. Should they not be?
They should be on it for the right reasons, and the right reasons for women that we know from evidence from all the international menopause societies is they should be using HRT to help their quality of life, to help menopause symptoms, to help them live their lives, accomplish all the roles they have in their life. And that's very important. And there's excellent evidence that HRT is safe and effective for those indications.
Those are startling figures, though, aren't they? 24% increase in risk of dementia diagnosis, and that only increases during the duration of treatment. I mean, for women who are on HRT now, they will feel like they can't get on with their everyday life without the use of HRT, but those are really startling figures to contend with.
They are, but it's important to be able to understand research if you're going to make headlines about it. And this study was a well-conducted study, but it was an observational study. It was a big study, case control study, as you say, over 60,000 women in the study with a good ratio of cases to controls. But we've had other studies that have shown quite similar findings over the last few years. We've had other studies that have suggested HRT may reduce the risk of dementia. The flaws in this study and the types of study that we're looking at, two main ones. It's an observational study, so we can see an association, but that doesn't mean HRT is the cause, and that's where a lot of people get really confused. The second thing is that the HRT treatment in the women in this study dates back to the year 2000, when we used extremely different hormone replacement therapy regimes. So we'd use much more synthetic hormones, which may have different effects on a woman's brain. So it's really difficult to extrapolate those findings to where we are today. What we don't want to do is say, oh, it's a rubbish study, we should ignore it, and HRT is likely to prevent dementia because other studies have suggested it reduces risk. I think we have to be really reflective, and all the international menopause societies suggest HRT is incredibly effective. It's the most effective treatment we have to ease menopause symptoms. With these study results, it may be something other than the HRT itself that is producing these results.
OK, really sensible advice. Anis Mukherjee, really good to see you this morning. Thank you so much for your time.
Really, really important context, I think. It's just one study looking in part at older versions of this thing. Let's not make any rash decisions.
Yep, exactly. And we're going to be sticking with the health theme. More worrying news, actually. Could diet drinks give you cancer? We'll be finding out. But first, your news with Rhiannon.
Ellie, thank you. Good morning. It's 11:33. Your top stories from the GB Newsroom. The government's launching what's being described as the most radical modernisation and reform of the NHS in its history. Ahead of the 75th anniversary of the health service, the 15-year plan will aim to plug shortages of over 300,000 staff in England. With £2.4 billion worth of funding over 5 years, it focuses on retaining and training staff, as well as adopting advanced technologies like AI. Zac Goldsmith has resigned from government a day after the Tory minister was named in a Privileges Committee report for interfering in Boris Johnson's Partygate probe. It's understood he was asked to apologise for his alleged role to undermine the investigation. In his resignation letter, Lord Goldsmith accused the government of apathy on climate change, saying it made his role as Minister for International Environment untenable. He also claims Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is uninterested in the environment. A court has been told Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey is a sexual bully who delights in making others feel uncomfortable. During his trial at Southwark Crown Court, prosecutors described the Hollywood star as a man who sexually assaults other men. The actor's facing 12 charges of sex offences against 4 men, which allegedly took place between 2001 and 2013. He denies the charges against him. And the energy regulator says it's great news that people will see their bills drop by £460 a year from tomorrow. Ofgem says it's taken a range of steps to stabilise the market and protect consumers. However, bills will remain a lot higher than they were 2 years ago, £800 more expensive. That's almost double. The regulator is urging people who are struggling to make payments to reach out to their suppliers as soon as possible. And you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2634 and €1.1651. The price of gold is £1,507.66 per ounce, and the FTSE 100's at 7,521 points.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for physical investment.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not
believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
The Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Monday to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's 11:40. You're with Britain's Newsroom on GB News with Tom Howard and Ellie Costello. Now, an artificial sweetener used in Diet Coke could possibly cause cancer. The World Health Organization is set to announce that aspartame, which is the sweetener used in the drink, will be listed as possibly carcinogenic to humans.
But the WHO's cancer research arm has come under fire before for causing unnecessary alarm. It's previously put working overnight and consuming red meat into its quote-unquote probably cancer-causing category. And let's remember, it only has 4 categories. It assesses everything. So potentially we're reading too much into this story. But let's get some more on this, because Ellie, you love Diet Coke. You've got one there. Am I safer with my original Coke than you are with your Diet Coke? Other soft drinks are available, I must stress. Let's get some more with the nutritionist Lily Suter. Lily, thank you for joining us. Ellie drinks a lot of Diet Coke.
I'm worried.
Should she be?
Well, yeah, this sort of information is interesting. Aspartame is found in a range of products such as dark soft drinks and chewing gum. There have been some population studies associating this sweetener with an increased risk of some cancers. There was a particularly large observational study conducted in over 100,000 people in France, which did show an association with non-nutritive sweeteners, including aspartame, in relation to increased cancer risk. But there were limitations to the study. It doesn't necessarily prove causation. And at the same time, there's been studies which have found no clear association, or the effect is very slight. So for aspartame to be classed as a possible carcinogen by IRAC, there has to be sufficient evidence in animal studies, but not necessarily in human studies. And this information also hasn't really taken into account how much of this sweetener a person can safely consume. So it's previously been suggested that the accepted daily limit is anywhere between 12 to 36 cans of dark soft drink a day in order to be a health risk. But what I would be interested in is, based on this new advice, how much can we consume each day in order to be that sort of cancer risk? I think we probably should be moving away from both sweeteners and sugar collectively if we can, and moving on to water. But obviously in a realistic world, this isn't always going to be possible. But we could use sweeteners, I guess, as a stepping stone to reduce our sugar intake in the short term. And there's lots of other ways of flavouring our water to make it more exciting. So, for example, we could infuse our water with fresh berries, mint, ginger, cucumber. We could use cold infused tea bags, which give our water a lovely fruity flavour without the additional sugar or sweeteners.
And you know what, I've been hearing this since I was at school, that because I've always liked Diet Coke, other brands are available. But I have heard it that the full-fat versions are actually healthier because you are dealing with sugar, and sugar we understand. It's chemicals and what's found in sweeteners, such as what we're talking about today, that we know less about, and that's what makes it unhealthier. Does that stand to be true to you?
I think we should be looking at reducing our intake of both sugar and sweeteners. Sugar can have just as sort of detrimental effects in terms of health and well-being. Currently, as a population, we are over-consuming our intake of added sugars within the diet, and soft drinks can be a cause of this. It can be a contributor to our sugar intake, particularly when it's in liquid format and we consume these sorts of drinks very, very quickly. But at the same time, as I said, the sweeteners can be a stepping stone to reducing our overall sugar intake for people who may be struggling with the flavour of just plain water. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's a long-term solution. And what we really should be doing is looking at the overall quality of our diet. What can we include? What all of those nourishing foods we can include within our diet which have benefits to health? Fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, which add sweetness into our diet, but also come with vitamins, minerals, fibre, antioxidants, which all have benefits to well-being. And consuming a nourishing diet may have benefits to health, which also then could translate into a reduced cancer risk as well.
Well, Lily Soutar, thank you so much for talking us through those issues. And I think I'm slightly reassured that as long as I don't have 36 of these things in one sitting, I should just about make it through at least to the end of the week. Yeah. I suppose that's true of everything. Don't have too much sugar, don't have too much sweetener, don't have just everything in moderation. Lily Soutar, thank you very much for joining us here on Britain's Newsroom.
That's key tonight.
Yeah. Everything in moderation.
It's a good message. Right, let's run you through the newspapers this morning, shall we? And the Mirror front page features a plea from a young girl named Poppy, who's written to the Prime Minister about the need for free school meals.
There it is, for those watching on television, her handwritten note.
Very sweet, actually.
And the Daily Mail, however, has led with Rwanda and that court ruling saying we should decide who comes here, not criminal gangs. That's on their front page.
The Eye leads with mortgage deals hiking again as big 6 banks raise their prices.
And the Financial Times says that record withdrawals from banks as Britain's households tap into savings. That's their headline.
Well, we're pleased now to be joined by Conservative peer Lord Daniel Moylan and Emma Burnell to discuss the latest headlines. Really good morning to you both. Good to see you again. And let's start, Lord Moylan, with the Mirror, shall we? And this very sweet letter from 7-year-old Poppy to the PM.
Well, am I the only person finding it slightly distasteful that children as young as 7 are being exploited to make a political argument about public expenditure and about the rights and obligations of parents, which is really what the nub of this story is about. And so there's the Daily Mirror going with this. If you open it up, you'll see there are lots of other children of similar age, I think from the same class, who've written a similar sort of letter. They've all been put up to it to do this, of course. And I think it's mildly distasteful. The fact is, parents do have obligations, and the state shouldn't be there to take on all parental responsibilities. Of course, the next thing that happens is you say that free school meals for everybody in the schools, and then free school meals for everybody in the holidays, and the schools have to stay open and so on, and there's no limit to it. Of course, people want something for free, and of course, I understand there's a cost of living crisis, but that can't be the answer to everything. Parents have responsibilities too.
And Emma, is it right? I mean, we're looking here at this spread in the mirror with a whole group of children standing with the very far left MP Zara Sultana, and I wonder, is it right to involve children in political campaigns, take children on political marches, use children in political adverts? Is that distasteful?
I mean, some of my fondest childhood memories are going on marches, so no, I absolutely don't think it is. I was in the local press as a very young child campaigning because they opened a gun shop around the corner from my school, which just seems bonkers, and still seems bonkers to me now at 48, so I'm not, my mind hasn't changed. Children are human beings, they are subject to state laws. They probably should have a voice in it. I'm not a big fan of, under 10s or whatever voting, which I know some people...
The problem that Lord Moylan was looking at here, that this looks cool, they're holding up these branded boards. This looks like it's been organised by an adult. That then the children... It's not organised.
I mean, it depends where it came from, and we don't know. But, I mean, certainly when I was that age, quite often, we would be asked, what do you want to do? And then an adult would help us to do that. So, I would be really surprised if those kids didn't come up with that themselves. It is an issue that kids are really aware of amongst their peers. When I was in school, there was a real class division between those who got free school meals and those who didn't. And we do know, as adults, we know that actually a child that's well-fed learns better, and that's an investment in their future and ours.
And Lord Moylan, what do you say to that?
Well, I'm just very relieved that Emma's not a big fan of votes for under 10s, which she just said. I mean, that is great. That shows some contact with the real world, with the adult world, with the grown-up world, which most of us and most of your viewers inhabit. I come back to this question. Parents have responsibilities to feed their children, and it's not the state's responsibility to take that on. Of course, you have to provide a meal during the day. If children are in school during the day, you have to provide a meal. And we are very generous about helping those on low incomes. But fundamentally, to say that the state is going to take over responsibility for everybody is yet another step in the nationalisation of the upbringing of children, which has already gone too far.
OK, well, let us know what you think of that at home. gbviews@gbnews.com. We do always like to hear from you. Emma, let's have a look at the eyes, shall we? And the biggest 6 high street banks have all raised rates on their mortgage deals again.
It doesn't show any sign of stopping at the moment, and that's really worrying for so many people. We've been talking about the cost of living crisis and one of the impacts on children. Families across the country are really worrying about, how they're going to deal with an increased mortgage payment in times where everything is costing more. Your energy bills are going up, your food bills are rocketing, and just yet another pressure on families, on people who own homes. And people, who took out mortgages 10 years ago when interest rates were very low, they're the ones who are coming to the end of those 10-year deals. And it's just such a big shock to go from a mortgage where the base rate was 0 to a mortgage where the base rate is now 5%. That's an enormous change for people whose wages have probably not gone up by those amounts over that time.
Was it therefore a policy error, perhaps, to have these incredibly low rates, give these people a sense of false security, have people over-leverage themselves to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds? We've discussed it before on this channel a lot, how there were 15% rates back in the early 90s, but a 15% rate on borrowing £90,000 is so very different on a 15% rate or a 5% rate on borrowing £200,000.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think the rates were necessarily wrong, but I think that the multiples were quite complex. That's a combination of factors that wage growth has just not happened, and house prices have soared at the same time. So the differential in the amount that you just have to borrow to get even close to a family home has just soared through the roof, particularly in our cities.
Lord Moylan, I want to bring you in now. The cheapest offering at these banks is 6.37%.
Yeah, this could have been avoided if the Bank of England, which has been in charge of inflation since 1997, if the Bank of England hadn't spent so much time printing money, which is what it was doing, keeping interest rates far too low, and thinking that this would not have, and proudly boasting that this would not have an inflationary consequence when everyone and his wife could see that it was going to do so. This should have happened earlier. The rate should have gone up earlier. Then inflation wouldn't have risen quite as high as it has, and it wouldn't have been necessary, perhaps, to put them up to the level that we're now seeing and predicting, which, as Emma said, might, at the moment, we don't see a limit to it. I mean, there will be a limit, but we don't see what that limit is. And they should have acted a great deal earlier. But the Bank of England has been totally and deliberately asleep at the wheel on this. 4 years, rates have been far too low.
Okay. Well, on that note, thank you both, Lord Moylan, Emma Burnell. Thank you so much for talking us through those big stories. Really glad we got to mortgages there as well. Huge problem for people up and down the country.
Yep, and really good to have voices from across the political spectrum as well.
And indeed, really good to have your company as well. I've so loved reading your views and your thoughts throughout this show. Thank you so much for joining us. Up next, it's the Live Desk.
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Pretty drab out there this Friday, lots of cloud around. Most places fairly damp as well, and it's a bit cooler than it has been, certainly compared to the rest of the month. This set of weather fronts have been steadily moving in through the night, and they're bringing the cloud and the outbreaks of rain. Quite mild air tucked in here, so quite a humid feel, but with the rain and drizzle, temperatures suppressed down below average and certainly lower than they have been for much of June. Parts of East Anglia still reasonably bright, but even here it will cloud over. Probably not seeing too much rain here until later on. Elsewhere, rain and drizzle will just tend to come and go through the day, keeping those temperatures in the high teens. But as I said, still quite a humid feel in parts of the west in particular. As we go into the weekend, well, that cloud and rain will continue to drift across most areas through this evening and start to pull away as we go through the early hours. Generally, though, it's going to be an overcast night, rain and drizzle on and off, and turning quite breezy around the west. A pretty warm night as well, particularly so in the east. Temperatures further west starting to dip away a little towards dawn, and that's a sign of a bit of a change as we head into the weekend. Should be a much brighter day tomorrow. Yes, it'll start pretty cloudy with further rain and drizzle. There will be more showers to come, chiefly over Scotland, some for northern England, the odd one for Northern Ireland. Much of the south of the country, though, dry, brightening up with sunny spells. Going to get pretty blustery, though. Gusty winds likely across northern Scotland. It could be a very wet day in Shetland. Temperatures a bit higher, particularly with some sunny spells over eastern parts of England, getting back into the low 20s. Through Saturday evening, it stays very blustery over much of Scotland. Very gusty winds in the far north. Further heavy showers coming in here as well. Elsewhere, again, mostly dry and a fresher night to come. A fresh feel, bright and breezy day for Sunday with some showers across the north and again, very windy across Scotland. Goodbye.
Now then,